いきなり南の島でバカンスって、エレナ様は何を考えているのかな。ああ、しばらくはサーバントお役御免ってわけね。それにしても綺麗な海。気持ちいい。こうなったらもう思いっきり楽しんじゃおうかな。
Hello everybody and welcome to this video looking at a game that's quite a few years old now but continues to get support, gets updates, and lots of people are still playing it with good reason. It's a very enjoyable, little casual, relaxing game, and that's Dead or Alive Xtreme 3. Now it's called Dead or Alive Xtreme 3 Scarlet on PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch and all that kind of stuff. I'm doing this video because I'm actually recording well and truly ahead of the time when I'll actually publish it, but I'm off in Japan, and while I'm over there my ability to create videos is fairly limited, so I felt like I should get a pipeline of contents together so that you weren't waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks to get my next video. And I've decided to do a couple of videos looking at topics that are of interest to me, and I feel like they haven't really been explored that much. And in this case, I'm looking at Dead or Alive Xtreme 3 as an example of the Gravier culture, or the Gravier tradition in Japan, and why I think that the way we look at this game in the West is a little bit different to the way that the Japanese look at it, and it has to do with the different ways that we look at the kind of model or style of, I guess, photography / art that we call pin-up, I guess, in the West, or swimsuit models in the West, and Gravier models in Japan. So to start with, Dead or Alive Xtreme is a homage and or satire, probably both, to the Gravier tradition in Japan. And it takes the ladies of Dead or Alive, the fighting game series obviously, and then repurposes them as, I guess, the kind of swimsuit model. Again, that's roughly how we translate what Gravier is in the West. We would call them swimsuit models, but it's a little bit more complex than that. I guess when we look at Gravier models in the West, we see something that is very sexualized. We see generally young women in very skimpy swimsuits, and the photography of Gravier is designed to really show off their bodies, and they tend to take very suggestive poses and so on and so forth. So in the West we do see them as something, I guess, equivalent to pin-up, and pin-up being the old style that isn't really in vogue anymore, but that kind of objectification of the women's bodies for the sexualization and objectification of the women's bodies for an audience that is predominantly men. So there's an element of that in Japan, but I would argue that Gravier is a slightly different thing to the Japanese culture. It's not quite seen in the same way that we saw pin-up, or we see the more sexy style of swimsuit models these days. So in Japanese society, the body, and as a result of that sex, is not something that's quite so sensitive to the people. In fact, it's seen as something much more natural, I guess, and it's seen as something that's, you know, natural urges, it's natural bodies, and not something to be so concerned about in terms of the impact that it has on society, and certainly not something to be as ashamed about. So for a culture that is in many ways very conservative, the Japanese culture is quite comfortable with the body and with depictions of nudity and all that kind of stuff. And if you go to enough festivals in Japan, you'll see it over and over again. You'll see people stripped down to virtually nothing. They're carting around huge giant phallic symbols, and there's a lot of indulgence, I guess, in the naked body, or the semi or close to naked body. So it's something that's much more common, I guess, in day-to-day view. In the West, the only time you really see people in a nearly naked state, it would be at the beach or whatever, and that's more tied to recreation. But in Japan, it's part of the very culture, part of the spirituality of the country, part of the way that people see the world. And that does change how they view stuff like this, stuff like Gravier models, stuff like a game like Dead or Alive. There is a very different interpretation in what they're seeing to what we see in the West. So to look at a particular example, I guess, and to frame it in ways that maybe is easiest to understand in the West, and easiest to explain in Japanese terms, there's a close link between Gravure and kawaii in Japan, and kawaii means cute. So to the Japanese eyes, Gravure is not just erotic and sexual, it's also charming and light and fun and all those kinds of words that we associate with kawaii. It's not just that the girl is almost naked and therefore sexy, it's that she's also quite, she's bright, she's bubbly, she's happy, and the clothes that she's wearing, or the swimsuits that she's wearing, are cute and charming. And that's a very different way of looking at something, and a way that I guess, we look at, perhaps, to think about in the West, we look at more fashion models, certain types of fashion models as being that kind of cute. They don't tend to be more dressed than in the West, than in Japan, I guess. But when we think about cute models doing whatever kind of fashion that they wear, that's close to, I guess, the way that the Japanese look at Gravure. So when we look at the pin-up model or the swimsuit model and we see something outrageously sexual, that's not where Gravure sits, because Gravure, the line between adult entertainment and Gravure is very clearly drawn. And yes, some Gravure models end up working in the adult entertainment industry in Japan. They go there after they can no longer kind of be a Gravure model, but that's not a direct path, and a lot of other Gravure models go on to a different kind of mainstream success. They become presenters, or they become entertainers, or actors, or singers, or idols, which is the music idol, So Gravure and the sex industry are distinct things in Japan, and that's hard for us to understand because our eyes, Western eyes, would look at them very similar. And that applies to Dead or Alive Xtreme as well, and any other game from Japan that has that Gravure element to it, Senran Kagura, for example, or whatever. Any game in which the character's body becomes something of a focus or a gameplay mode or something important to the overall experience of the game is something that we kind of step back at and we say, well, that's a little bit, that's a bit sexual, because that's how we look at these things. We don't have that same level of comfort with the body that they do in Japan, so the way we view a game which is all about the body becomes a little bit different. And that's where I think a lot of the humour of Dead or Alive Xtreme 3 is also kind of lost in the West, because Dead or Alive Xtreme 3 is absolutely a satire. It is designed to be quite funny and amusing to both play and to watch, and you're meant to get a laugh out of it. But I think a lot of people in the West see it as something a little bit creepy and anything but funny, and that is because what we see is just that sex side of things. We don't see them as Gravure models, or we don't see them as being that kind of homage slash satire of Gravure models. We see them as being just purely pin-up in tone, and as a result we don't really laugh along with the game. We see the poses that the characters take as being genuine rather than satirical, not over the top, or if they're over the top, it's over the top to enhance the sexuality of them, rather than they're over the top because that's ridiculous and therefore funny. So we do look at Dead or Alive Xtreme 3 in a very different way in the West, and that's definitely tainted the conversations that people tend to have about this game. People don't tend to look at Dead or Alive Xtreme as a Japanese product, they tend to look at it as a product, and that affects their interpretation of it. Perhaps another way to look at it in Western tones, just to finish up, would be to look at it a little bit more like, I guess, the pop music industry. Because if you look at the pop music video clips that get created, they tend to be very sexual and very over-the-top sexual in nature. The dancing, the writhing bodies, all of that kind of stuff. It seems to be that artists compete with one another, especially in the R&B and kind of pop spaces. They compete with one another to kind of outsex one another. And there's a legitimacy of that in the West because we see it as being, I guess, a kind of empowerment story, and we tend to look at that approach to sexuality as something that is acceptable within our culture, That's why there's no calls to ban pop music video clips, or there's no attempts to kind of really tone things down. There's a couple of people out there that are waving the flag, but for the most part, people are comfortable with that. I think in Japan it's a similar thing. This Gravure style, this kind of cute idol wearing cute swimsuits and posing in very kind of provocative poses, is that kind of, it's legitimized in Japan. It's something that's acceptable within the boundaries of that culture, and I think that that's well worth remembering when we look at a game like this and discuss a game like this. It's really important that when we talk about these games, we talk about them from the perspective in which they are created, because the culture that created the game is reflected through the game. And there's no point really applying our standards to a game like this, because that would be missing a big piece of the puzzle, and it would be analysing the game in such a way that is not entirely authentic to the spirit of the game or what it was attempting to achieve. And that leads to, I guess, a degree of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. Anyway, that's enough for this video. I actually also did it because I just like putting clips of Dead or Alive Xtreme on my YouTube. I hope it was interesting anyway. I know it kind of touches on things that I've talked about a little bit in the past, but it is a topic that I keep coming back to because it's a topic that doesn't really get clarified. It just keeps going on, and I don't see the conversation or the discourse around this topic really improving. So I'll keep flying the flag to try and do my bit to encourage people to look at these things in a little bit more nuanced way. And in the meantime, I'll just keep posting up videos and whatnot of Dead or Alive. Thanks very much for watching. Please do back me on Patreon like I ask every video. It helps. It really, really helps. And I know I'm begging at this stage, but I would like to do more and more and really expand this YouTube. To do that, I need the money. And you know, it's worth it for you as well. By backing me on Patreon, you do get my visual novels. The first one's been there for a while now. By the time you hear this clip, I'll be getting very close to releasing the first full one, which will give you 4 or 5 hours, I think, of gameplays to enjoy, and a much more in-depth story and plenty of art to enjoy. So yeah, that's a big initiative from me, and I would really appreciate your support if you do enjoy my videos and or my work on digitallydownloaded.net. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we will see you at the next video.
見えたぞ楽しみましょう。楽しみじゃのう。勝負。ここにしよう。
No more bet